Good morning, everyone, from a very dreary but real life fall day here in Washington. My name is Teresa Welsh, and I'm a senior reporter here at Devex, and I write about food systems. I also author our weekly newsletter about food systems, Devex Dish. I'm pleased to welcome you to our Fireside Chat conversation today, where we are going to be talking about the true cost of food. I am joined by Ruth Richardson, who's the executive director of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, as well as Geeta, and she's the advisor and global lead for food systems at the World Bank. Welcome to you both. Thanks so much for being with us this morning.
Fantastic to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa.
So we are going to dive right in because our time is short. So we're talking about the true cost of food. And Ruth, I'm going to come to you to tell us a little bit about the principle of true cost accounting, which if you follow the food system space, you're probably familiar with, but you might not be if you don't follow that space. So tell us a little bit about true cost accounting and why this is something that we need to care about when we're talking about forming the global food system.
Thanks, Teresa. So simply put, true cost accounting is a tool to see all the costs and benefits of food systems. So we have typically looked at food systems through the lens of yield and income. Those are the sorts of things we're looking for. Those are impacts of the food system, increased yield, better incomes. However, there's so many other costs and benefits that arise from this food system. We're talking about environmental impacts and benefits. We're talking about health impacts and benefits. We're talking about social cultural impacts and benefits. So if you think about soil erosion, if you think about greenhouse gas emissions, if you think about diet-related disease, if you think about displacement of indigenous peoples from palm oil plantations, these are all impacts of the food system. True cost accounting helps us see that full picture. I think of it as a huge Excel spreadsheet where we can see all these impacts and benefits. It's important to note, number one, that we're looking at both positive and negative. So we want to see positive impacts and negative impacts. So we want to be able to see both, for instance, soil erosion, which is a negative impact. And we also want to see healthy diets and, increased nutrition for families as a positive impact. So that's the first thing that I wanted to mention just in terms of how we think about true cost accounting. The second thing is that we must understand that there are ways to provide monetary value and non-monetary value. So some of these things we can put a price on. In the environmental realm, for instance, we can put a price on water pollution, but there's some things we can't put a price on. For instance, displacement of indigenous peoples. But it's important that we still see those impacts and value those impacts, which is why we call it true cost accounting or true value accounting.
Thanks so much for that, Ruth. I think the idea of one big giant spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet, is what some people's nightmares are made of. But we are going to tell you all about in our conversation why this is something that you really should be paying attention to. Geeta, I'm going to come to you next to talk a little bit about the way the World Bank thinks about the food system financing issue and why it's so important that we are paying attention to those hidden costs behind the food system.
Thanks, Teresa. I think Ruth has laid out a very, very nice backdrop and the context. In 2019, margins of the UNGA meetings, the UN General Assembly, there was a report launched by FOLU on growing better. And one of the issues that the report laid out explicitly is exactly the point you just raised, the hidden costs of the food system, which was around $12 trillion. And the market value is $10 trillion, so 20% higher in terms of hidden costs. And these hidden costs are towards people. And we know that 3 billion people today, every second person on this earth, has some form of malnutrition, either hunger, too little to eat, or wrong type of calories, right? And the second big sort of the hidden cost is towards the environment and climate, and a big reason and of course then the issues around equity and non-inclusive growth paradigms that food systems do encourage in some places. But But the more important part in terms of for us at the World Bank is a food system not fit for purpose, exactly the point that Ruth made, and can still rely on this kind of financing, both public and private, means that the financing in part has to be the solution if we want the systems to change. And I think that's a very, very important kind of a big thrust for us. The second point that I just want to make along the similar lines, and we can delve more into details as we go deeper, is the point that Ruth made, that food systems are right now 25% of emissions, but business as usual are going to be the highest emission, the sector that has the highest emissions 2050 onwards. And so I think a very important part of decarbonization strategies or transition strategies for decarbonation in countries needs to have food systems lean in. Energy alone cannot deliver on the decarbonization goals and milestones. So let me stop there and pass it back to you.
Thanks so much. You both, I think, have set the scene wonderfully for this conversation, and both of you have mentioned climate. And of course, we're all aware COP negotiations are going on at this moment. So I think this is a great frame for our event today that really demonstrates why figuring out how much the food system and its reform actually costs is so key. The food systems agenda is intimately interlinked with the climate agenda, and neither can be achieved without the other. Ruth, I'd like to come back to you to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the research that your organization has conducted on true cost accounting. Give us maybe an example or two that really demonstrates the value of this principle and how, different countries, different communities can use this principle to reform their food system, to, first see what their problems really are, see what the actual cost is, and use that information, the power of that information, to drive the reform that's needed.
Thanks, Teresa. So yes, the Global Alliance has been working for almost a decade on true cost accounting, and we're very pleased to have joined the European Union and UN Environment in developing one of the most holistic and comprehensive true cost accounting tools, which is called TVAG-Food. We also have an accelerator with many of the main stakeholders and players coming together to talk about harmonization and policy development and communication. So there's a lot happening in this field. In terms of how this is actually used, we see sort of three main users. We see policymakers and decision makers. We see businesses, and we see farmers. It can be used by many, many other stakeholders, but I think those are three of the main ones. In terms of business, this is really starting to take root within business. I know World Business Council on Sustainable Development has been a huge supporter of true cost accounting. And there are companies like IOSTA and OLAM that are actually utilizing these tools to understand how to make better decision making. On the policy front, I think this is critical. Geeta joined a webinar that we did and talked a lot about how this can be a tool for governance, how to help governments understand how they navigate things like their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Critically important. And then there are other ways that farmers can use it. Or other organizations, not-for-profit organizations, cooperatives. Let me give you one example. There's an organization called Masipag in the Philippines, which is a decentralized farmer-led network of small growers, mostly focused on rice production, rice cultivation. We did a study called True Value, revealing the positive impacts of food systems transformation. And in that, we looked at all the positive impacts that these sorts of initiatives are having. And we found that Masipag, for instance, is a place where small farmer networks are really creating resiliency across culture, agriculture, ecosystems, and the economy. We found that local and regional networks are essential for channeling their voices into national decision-making. Through Masipag, we found that crop genetic diversity strongly contributes to everything from nutritional security to climate change adaptation, and that agroecology, or agriculture based on ecological principles, links food production at the farm level to much broader socio and ecological systems. So you can see here through the analysis that we find all these multiple impacts, and we can see that broader picture, and therefore governments, countries, businesses, organizations can make better and more informed decisions.
I think that's such an important point, is really growing this evidence base, and how that's, something you guys are really working on, is conducting this research. Because I think, you say true cost accounting, again, back to the spreadsheets, it sounds, really hard to sort of get your fingers on. It sounds complicated to, actually put into practice. And so, you're really using the data to show people what the value of this is.
Yes, absolutely. If I could just add to that, for us at the Global Alliance, evidence is so critical. And we believe that our evidence base should be very diverse. Often we look to scientific evidence, which also often means kind of Western, Northern scientific evidence, which is really critically important. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that we need to couple that on equal footing with other types of evidence, like Indigenous knowledge, farmer knowledge, community knowledge. And true cost accounting is a way to hold that up, to include that, incorporate it. So again, we see the full picture and therefore can make better decisions.
Geeta, I would love to hear from you on this evidence piece, and hear a little bit about how the World Bank is using, data evidence that organizations like Ruth are generating about the food system to determine, your future financing levels, what you're going to fund, who you're going to fund when it comes to the food system.
Thanks a lot, Teresa. Ruth made some very, very powerful points. So before I answer that question directly, I want to put a context, particularly because it's the week COP's happening. So UNFCCC has just come out with, and IPCC both came out with a report where it was clear that the global ambitions today are taking us to a world of 2.7 degrees, so almost twice as high as was agreed and committed to in Paris. And if I may say so very humbly, the NDCs that are really nationally determined commitments that nations define what their decarbonization pathways and are going to look like, really need to step up quite substantially, as you know. And then I think Ruth is exactly right. I mean, it almost is very amusing when people keep talking about scientific evidence, because in many places, research has not been funded enough to really be able to create the right kind of so-called scientific evidence, particularly in a lot of the developing countries. So one does have to rely on all kinds of evidence available, and really broaden that. So couldn't agree more. The second point I wanted to make, again, in terms of how the World Bank works and thinks about transitions in these countries using evidences, to deliver a food system fit for purpose, the numbers are anywhere between 300 to 350 billion a year. Clearly, no one institution can deliver on this. So what does that mean? It means very clearly that the private finance that have deep pockets, the public finance, the multilateral finance, the philanthropies need to come together very differently. Food systems still are seen as high risk. Yes, we are getting more evidence, but the risk, the perception of risk remains still very high. So if you want private finance to come in a big way to really fund the transitions in the food system, for both ensuring resilience, but definitely on the mitigation side, then I think finance, the risk pricing needs to be done a little bit differently. And risk pricing needs to then, that's where then the philanthropy and the multilateral and government finance needs to come in. $700 billion a year or around that aspect is the public support to agriculture. And the same support is really creating unhealthy people and a bankrupt planet, right? So there is a lot of room, as long as there is a will and an urgency and a demand for very bold actions. Some of the, based on the evidence, as you correctly say, we have defined a few platforms where we are really working very ambitiously and assertively, really trying to package financing differently. One is low emission rice. Okay, this is a win-win. It's not taking food away. It's just putting the food with sort of the right carbon footprint. silvopastoral systems, um, really looking at losses and waste by looking at disrupting refrigeration. So a very different kind of agrologistics, particularly with the focus on the renewables coming in here. And that really creates a different shelf life. So I think that's really where our head is for the next few months, to be able to put this packaging with all the granularity out there and really make a big move on the transformation story. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Geeta. Yeah, I think it is so important to put that actual price tag on it, and that can make it seem intimidating and can be an excuse for people to say, "Whoa, this is too hard. We can't figure it out. It's too expensive." I mean, I think more broadly, that's the issue we're seeing with the climate negotiations as well that are ongoing right now, as people get overwhelmed by the scope of the problem and don't feel like there's anything that that we can do. And so to round out our conversation, I'd like to come back to you both on sort of more of a hopeful note of what we can be doing. Ruth, obviously, again, we're in the middle of COP, and I'd love to hear about how you are, expecting, hoping, pushing for that agenda to be tied to the outcomes of the UN Food Systems Summit that we saw in September, and really pushing this agenda forward with tangible outcomes.
Yes, thanks, Teresa. I want to pick up on 2 points that Geeta made, just in terms of that hopeful future. Number one is that we believe that food system transformation is one of the most powerful levers to get to multiple goals, whether we're talking about hunger, climate change, pandemics, global health, you name it. It is at the center of all these issues. And so if we can harness the power of food systems to transform the world, then I think we can transform the world. One of the ways, very practically speaking, is to point to something that Geeta mentioned, is the NDCs. We really need to build food systems into the nationally determined contributions of countries. We're doing a report that will come out early 2022 with an analysis of how countries have or have not done that. And what we're finding is they mostly have not done that. So there's huge opportunity there. So that's number one. Number two is, again, something that Geeta pointed to, which is how do we align different modes of finance, public, private, philanthropic, multilateral? I think that we really need to start thinking about how we work together better, how we align our financing in order to support this. And true cost accounting can be a tool to help us find those areas of consensus, those areas of alignment, because those dollars are so critical in that, when we think about cheap food that is really harming the planet and people, that cheap food is actually very expensive. So, we need to change the story. We need to change the financing flows in order to shift those systems to really help us deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals and other critical global commitments that we have.
And I think people are starting to see some of those things in their daily lives, at least here in the United States. We have some inflation happening and prices are going up, which, also has to do with the shipping constrictions that are happening globally. And people are noticing they're paying more for food and they are not interested in it. We have been trained here in the US to expect really low prices and to get things for less than what they're worth. And so I think, that's an obvious challenge, right? Is showing people, if we're going to fix all of these interlocking issues, we actually do need to be paying for it, which of course is not something people like to hear very often. Geeta, just a few minutes left. We're going to come to you. What are some of the urgent actions that you and the World Bank are working on, and a couple of ideas that you're really focusing on in terms of how to bring private finance into this issue as well, financing food systems reform?
Thanks, Teresa. Like Ruth, I also am very hopeful. I think there is a huge opportunity on the food system stepping up, and it's in some ways, if one follows closely with the energy transformation. It's very clear that the world is getting ready for a global energy crisis because we haven't been able to define the transition effectively. But in foods, and this is, I think, makes food systems even more relevant, because in 3 or 4 big platforms, like what I laid out in low emission rice or addressing losses and waste, or improving silvipastoral systems and then 2 billion hectares of degraded land. There's only win-win, including on jobs, of quality of food, lower carbon emissions, that I think the food sector can lean in much more powerfully while the world is trying to figure out a more sort of the renewable, the world of non-fossil fuel in the short to the medium term. Now, some of the big platforms that we are working on and getting the different sources of financing are exactly this: rice, silvipastoral systems, and food loss and waste. If we can get some of these out there, consistent with country demand, consistent with their own national pathways, reflective in their NDCs, I think then then we can declare. I mean, then it's going to be a huge domino effect globally. So thanks for having us. Over to you.
Thanks so much to you both. I think that's a great way to end this conversation on that call to action, bringing all of these pieces together. I, of course, will be watching what happens over the next 2 weeks with the climate negotiations, what we see that relates to the food system. Thank you both so much for joining us. And I hope that you'll continue to follow these issues with us at Devex. Thanks to our global audience for joining us for this panel today. If you'd like to subscribe to Devex Dish, you can go to our website and you will find a way to do that. We would love to have you join us. And thanks so much for being here for our conversation today.
Thank you, Teresa.